As we move to chapter 4, we focus on ethical and social issues in information systems. As we look at the first couple of slides, thinking about mobile phones throughout the last several years, so to speak, thinking about the problem, obviously there are opportunities abound from new technology, and they continue to pop up each and every day. And again, some of the solutions that we look at, obviously, being some of those technology solutions. As we think about, some of the ethical perspectives or considerations with mobile phones, we start to think about um, the mobile location tracking systems that are able to be enabled within phones. Um, which obviously demonstrates how technological innovations can be that double-edged sword. We all love having the technology and the ability to use it on a daily basis, but then some of those ethical type considerations start to come into play, which really causes us to think about how we use them, where we use them, etc. So almost every day, we see examples of business ethical failures reported in the news media. We see it online, in newspapers, etc. Think about what current example of ethical lapses in well known organizations and firms there might be that you can think about. What role do you think information systems played as part of those ethical failures, if any? Potentially a positive role by helping to expose ethical lapses, or maybe even a negative role by enabling those events. Again, just thinking about some of those ethical dilemmas that are presented by information systems and or new developments in technology alone, we start to think about privacy, obviously a very important issue, both in our personal and professional lives. um, we start to think about business models such as Google, Facebook, other companies that ultimately depend on getting us or users, consumers, to give up that personal information so that it can be used to market and sell products. Think about some of those opportunities where information technology information technology has challenged some area of ethics, social life, or even legal arrangements. Issues surrounding the impact of social media, online privacy, mobile devices, online gaming, government surveillance, just a couple of those that ultimately come to mind. Think about examples for each of the five major issues that are identified here. For example, an issue dealing with information rights might be: what rights do individuals possess with respect to themselves? What do they have a right to protect? An issue dealing with quality of life might be: what values should be preserved in an information and knowledge based society? Maybe an issue dealing with the system quality might be: what standards of data and system quality should we demand to protect individual rights and the safety of society? Which of these trends do you believe might have the most adverse consequences? Why might you think that or feel that way? Do the positives outweigh the negatives for all of the issues? Why or why not? Again, thinking about technology, online profiling is one of the most controversial computer related ethical, social, and political issues of today. Although used fairly extensively on the internet, it's also used by insurance firms, health insurance firms, casinos, and of course, national authorities around the globe for finding potential terrorists as well as domestic opponents. Information systems as we know them don't exist in a vacuum, and these concepts are instrumental in understanding the impact of systems and ultimately measuring their success. Why do you think liability and due process are such important ethical concepts? Perhaps because they provide recourse to individuals negatively affected by mismanagement of information systems, providing incentive to quote unquote play by the rules, so to speak. When we look at the 5 step process for ethical analysis, do you believe that any aspect is lacking from the process? If so, what? Can you think about a brief example of an ethical dilemma? How you would resolve it using the process that you see in front of you? We want to make sure that we understand the difference between categorical imperative and the rule of change. Briefly, the difference is that the categorical imperative spans the entirety of the populace, whereas the rule of change applies to the decisions of one person over time. For example, categorical imperative applies to an employee who tries to steal money from his employer. He shouldn't do this because if all employees attempted to do so, obviously the company would fail. The slippery slope rule applied to the same situation might run as follows. Although the employees stealing $1 from the company would not lead to any true problem, repeatedly stealing $1 or stealing a lot of dollars would be unacceptable and ultimately lead to the destruction of the company. How does the no free lunch rule relate to copyrights, patents, trademarks? The appearance of unethical behavior is as harmful as actual unethical behavior at times. So, adherence to these principles is critical. In an age of open source software, how does the principle of no free lunch, quote unquote, work out? Open source software is an example of an economic good which is licensed by the creator for distribution, oftentimes without charge or even attribution. In this case, there is a quote unquote free lunch, but it occurs because the creators of the software consent to that arrangement. Do you believe that there are sufficient protections for privacy in law? If not, what are possible methods of developing appropriate privacy protections? When we look at Table 4.3 in the text, there are a variety of other laws affecting both the government and private institutions, but few areas of the private sector are as well regulated with respect to privacy. When we think about mutuality of interest between record holder and individual, Briefly, the individual wants to engage in a transaction, and the record holder needs information about the individual to support the transaction. And so, obviously, in that example, both are interested parties in the overall transaction. Do you believe that websites that you visit actually disclose their data collection and utilization practices? Is it difficult to find them? At some point, read part of a website's privacy policy. Ask yourself, what does it really mean? Often, so called privacy policies are actually terms of service agreements, and the word privacy isn't even mentioned. Looking at the examples that are in front of you, most of us have encountered cookies. No, not the cookies that we eat and love, but those on the computer. What are our attitudes towards these technologies? Cookies can be useful at trusted sites, but perhaps invasive at others. Have you had any experiences with spyware or web bugs on your own computers? Could you identify if you were being tracked? Do you believe that businesses should be pressed to provide more comprehensive privacy protections online? Businesses prefer the looser regulation, but individuals may not. Most individuals do not take the proper steps to ensure their own privacy in any case. Most people do not know how to protect their privacy online. Does that mean the privacy is unimportant to them or that people don't care about their privacy? This slide lists some of those technical solutions that are available for us, both within our enterprise organizations, but also even at home. At times, some may be unwilling to admit to infringing upon intellectual property rights, but ask, are you familiar with the internet and its ability to bypass intellectual property protections? Do you believe that legislation such as DMCA is having any impact or effect? Do we know friends who have downloaded quote unquote free music from sites? What about free videos? What impact does that have on the global aspect of the music industry? If we think about software failures, who ultimately is responsible? Is it the user? Is it the organization that created it? Oftentimes, it can be difficult to identify who ultimately is responsible in these situations. Do you have your own opinions about when software is good enough? Does it depend on the particular product? For example, can we distinguish between software used by air traffic controllers versus software used for word processing? Do you believe there are different levels of acceptable quality for those products? Have you ever witnessed any of these negative consequences firsthand? Perhaps it's likely that you know someone who's become dependent on their computer to some extent, or who have experienced something similar firsthand. Which of the above consequences do you feel is most alarming? What experiences do you have with spam? A notable statistic is that spam accounts for around 55% of all email traffic and is relatively unlikely to decrease because it is so difficult to regulate and so cheap to send. Do you believe that the end result of continuing advances in information technology will be rising unemployment in a small number of elite corporate professionals? For instance, we have some evidence that today's manufacturing technology, so for instance, robots, computer controlled machines, is displacing factory jobs. What impact will we continue to see over time? Looking at some of the health risks that are identified here, have you ever encountered any of these, either from personal experience or someone that you know? How do we avoid these and or minimize the impact?